Imagine you're a Roman senator strolling through the Sabora, Rome's notorious pleasure district. You're on a typical walk when something stops you dead in your tracks. There's a familiar face among the prostitutes working in a crowded brothel. Your heart skips a beat as you recognize her. This is not just any common woman, but Valeria Messalina, the Empress of Rome, wife to Emperor Claudius. She's here, willingly degrading herself in the lowest of places, seeking anonymous encounters with ordinary citizens of the empire. This isn't some desperate woman caught in a terrible situation. Now this is the Empress, the most powerful woman in the Roman world, sneaking away from the imperial palace at night to compete with prostitutes, eager to show that she could outdo anyone, even in sexual endurance. You think you know about the decadence of Rome? What you're about to discover about Messalina will make even Caligula seem tame in comparison. She didn't just abuse her power, she used her sexuality as a weapon, terrorizing the empire and sealing her own tragic fate. In 38 CE, Rome celebrated a royal wedding that seemed like the perfect picture of imperial unity. At just 15 years old, Valeria Messalina married Claudius, the Emperor of Rome. The ceremony was a grand affair, symbolizing everything the Romans valued: nobility, fertility, and the continuation of their divine bloodline. She was everything an empress was supposed to be: young, beautiful, from an ancient noble family, and capable of bearing legitimate heirs for the empire. Claudius, who was 13 years worse injured and physically impaired due to what we now know as cerebral palsy, seemed thankful to have secured such a prize. Contemporary accounts describe Messalina as the epitome of Roman beauty: fair skin, golden hair, and the graceful features that marked aristocratic heritage. She fulfilled her duties perfectly, bearing to children for Claudius and appearing at state events with the required dignity. In Roman society, women were judged based on strict moral codes, with virtuous wives and mothers at the top of the hierarchy, while prostitutes and entertainers were at the bottom. An empress, in particular, had to embody virtue so completely that even the smallest rumors of impropriety could tighten the stability of the empire. But behind the grand walls of the imperial palace, things were taking a much darker turn. The young woman who hosted dignified dinner parties and attended religious ceremonies with grace was secretly plotting late-night adventures that would shock even the most hardened members of the Roman aristocracy. The transformation began quietly in her first year as empress. Servants began noticing her odd behavior. She would dismiss her guards at odd hours, claiming to be tired, and slip away from her chambers wearing simple clothing to conceal her identity. At first, these nighttime escapes seemed like harmless acts of rebellion, the young woman yearning for adventure outside the rigid constraints of palace life. However, these midnight excursions soon took on a much darker, more deliberate form. Messalina began observing the lives of Rome's prostitutes, studying their techniques, their territories, and the types of men they entertained. This was mere curiosity; it was research, done with the meticulous precision of a military strategist. The first incident that became widely known occurred during the Saturnalia festival in 40 CE. During this festival, the usual social order was temporarily reversed, and people could let loose. While Claudius attended religious duties, Messalina, disguised as a commoner, ventured into the Sabora. What began as an innocent exploration of ordinary Roman life soon spiraled into a dangerous obsession. She wanted to prove her sexual prowess against that of the city's professional prostitutes. Tacitus, the historian, recorded whispers from palace insiders who had learned of Messalina's secret. She approached a brothel keeper, offering to work for one night without revealing her true identity. The brothel owner, assuming she was an aristocratic woman seeking a thrill, agreed. But what Messalina did that night stunned everyone. She serviced more clients than the most experienced women in the brothel. Her stamina was unmatched, leaving even the most seasoned workers in awe. As dawn broke and other women were exhausted and ready to stop, Messalina refused to leave. She demanded more men, more challenges, and more opportunities to show that an empress could outdo any common prostitute. Eventually, the brothel owner had to force her to leave. But the damage was done. Messalina had found her a new obsession. Within a few months of her first experience at the brothel, Messalina had perfected a system for her late-night escapades. She arranged for trusted servants to smuggle her out of the palace, used disguises to completely alter her appearance, and adopted fake identities that allowed her to move freely through Rome's underground sex trade. But simple prostitution was no longer enough to satisfy her competitive drive. She began organizing challenges with some of Rome's most celebrated courtesans, betting large sums of money on her ability to service more men in a single night than any professional. These contests were private affairs. They attracted crowds of wealthy Romans eager to witness their empress degrade herself for sport. The most infamous of these competitions occurred in 41 CE when Messalina challenged Scylla, Rome's most famous prostitute, to an endurance trial. The rules were simple: whoever could service the most clients from sunset to sunrise would win a fortune in gold. The night began with the elite of Rome, senators, and wealthy citizens, placing bets on the two women. Scylla, a seasoned veteran, paced herself throughout the night, carefully managing her energy to ensure she could handle the long hours. By dawn, she had serviced 25 men and declared herself finished, exhausted but victorious. Messalina, however, was just getting started. Even after Scylla had called it a night, the empress kept going. She accepted new clients, driven not just by lust, but by a deep compulsion to prove herself superior to the professionals. By the time dawn broke, Messalina had serviced her to 30 men, stopping only when no more clients could be found. Her victory, though, wasn't celebrated. It was witnessed in stunned silence by the Roman elite, who had come to witness something they would never forget. The psychological weight of what they had seen was enormous. This was a desperate woman caught in degrading circumstances. This was the most powerful woman in the world choosing humiliation as entertainment. For Messalina, the contrast between her public dignity and private degradation was the key to her satisfaction. The more she humiliated herself, the greater her pleasure. But these public contests were only the beginning of her twisted journey. She soon decided that simple, secret prostitution wasn't enough to satisfy her desires for power and perversion. In 42 CE, Messalina took things even further. She established what would later be known as one of the most audacious criminal operations in Roman history, a brothel, operating under imperial protection that catered to Rome's most powerful men. This wasn't a simple brothel. It was a high-end operation staffed by aristocratic women, and it served the city's elite. The brothel was hidden in plain sight, disguised as a private club for social gatherings, located in a luxurious villa near the Campus Martius. Messalina used her imperial authority to recruit women for the operation, coercing them into participation under threat of political or financial ruin. These women, many from noble families, were forced into her service, their families facing threats if they refused. Messalina's criminal brilliance lay in her ability to select clients. Instead of serving random customers like the common prostitutes, she targeted senators, military commanders, and wealthy merchants, those who held valuable information or political power. Every encounter in this brothel was meticulously documented by hidden servants. These servants gathered intelligence about the clients, recorded conversations, and identified their weaknesses. This information gave Messalina an unprecedented advantage over the very men who should have been governing the empire. She knew which senators were planning to oppose Claudius, which generals were plotting treason, and which merchants were involved in shady dealings. With this knowledge, she was able to manipulate and control key figures in Roman society. Her methods were ruthless and calculated. She carefully observed men at state functions and invited them to her villa under the pretext of social gatherings. Once there, the entertainment would start as expected: fine food, music, and conversation. But soon, the events would take a darker turn. The entertainment escalated, and soon, the aristocratic women were revealed, not just as part of the show, but as women who were now publicly humiliated by their involvement in Messalina's scheme. The psychological toll on these men was immense. They didn't just engage with prostitutes, they had sex with the empress or with the wives and daughters of their peers. The shame was unbearable, and it ensured their silence. Messalina had created a perfect system of blackmail, where every high-ranking official in Rome was either compromised or terrified to defy her. But the most disturbing aspect of her operation was how it corroded the very fabric of Roman society. The empress had forced noble women to betray their class, turned political leaders into her puppets, and twisted the sacred bonds of marriage and family into tools of manipulation. The empire's decision-making process had been quietly subverted by a brothel madam who happened to be married to the emperor. By 44 CE, Messalina's insatiable hunger for power and perversion pushed her to even more shocking extremes. Operating in secret no longer held the same excitement for her. She needed something bigger, more public, something that would cement her dominance over the empire. And so she began organizing massive, public orgies. These were not just private indulgences but carefully staged events designed to serve as both entertainment and political theater, where Rome's elite would be forced to participate in humiliating spectacles that reinforced her control over the imperial leadership. What began as formal religious festivals would transform under Messalina's influence. At first, they seemed like typical state rituals, rites to honor various gods and goddesses, attended by senators, military leaders, and their families. But as the night wore on, these ceremonies would slowly evolve into scenes of degrading and systematic sexual humiliation. Messalina's brilliance lay in her ability to escalate the situation gradually, lulling her guests into a false sense of comfort before throwing them into situations they could never have anticipated. At first, the participants would engage in traditional rituals, the sort that had been practiced for centuries. But soon, Messalina would introduce ancient customs that, she claimed, were part of the true nature of these ceremonies. These customs were actually deeply depraved acts, and by the time her guests realized what was happening, they had already been compromised. Senators who had come to the event expecting to engage in respectable rituals found themselves forced to participate in sexual acts with each other, humiliated in ways they could never recover from. The Empress watched, sometimes providing commentary, sometimes joining in the acts herself. This was her ultimate manipulation. By forcing public degradation, she ensured that the Roman leadership was too ashamed to ever oppose her. These orgies weren't just about sexual pleasure, they were about control. The Empress understood that public humiliation was a far more effective way to neutralize her political rivals than execution ever could be. By making her enemies degrade themselves in front of their peers, she destroyed their dignity, their influence, and their ability to challenge her authority. Messalina had mastered the art of blackmail, using sexual humiliation as a tool to control even the most powerful men in Rome. As if this wasn't enough, Messalina also began incorporating younger participants into these events. Palace records suggest she recruited the sons and daughters of prominent families, convincing them to join in these religious observances. These young people, raised to follow imperial authority without question, became unwilling participants in their own exploitation. The very foundations of Roman society, family, marriage, loyalty, were being corrupted by Messalina's manipulation. In the process, she had made herself untouchable. Any attempt to expose her crimes would risk implicating the most powerful families in Rome. Over time, the effects of Messalina's reign became apparent. Foreign diplomats began to notice strange shifts in Roman policy, particularly decisions that seemed to favor certain individuals without reason. Military leaders who had no qualifications were suddenly given high-ranking positions. Trade agreements favored merchants with no clear connections to the emperor, and political appointments seemed driven by personal rather than imperial interests. Rome's power structure had been quietly undermined by a woman who had mastered the art of political manipulation through sexual coercion. But even these public spectacles weren't enough for Messalina. She was no longer content with just controlling the powerful men of Rome. By 48 CE, her obsession with power and scandal reached its peak when she committed an act so brazen that it shocked even the most jaded Romans. While her husband, Emperor Claudius, was away overseeing grain shipments in Ostia, Messalina held an official wedding ceremony. But this wasn't a private affair or a symbolic act, it was a full, legal Roman marriage. She married Gaius Silius, the handsome young senator she had been pursuing for months. The ceremony included the full Roman wedding rites, with religious ceremonies, official witnesses, and formal contracts. In essence, Messalina had divorced Claudius and married another man while still holding the title of Empress. This was a shocking legal and political move, as Roman law recognized her new marriage as legitimate, while she remained the emperor's wife. The implications were enormous. The wedding celebration turned into a multi-day orgy, with Rome's remaining uncorked aristocracy forced to participate. Even the most compromised of her allies could no longer deny that Messalina had gone too far. This wasn't just an indulgence or secret rebellion anymore. It was an open act of defiance against Claudius, and more disturbingly, a challenge to the very foundation of imperial authority. The audacity of Messalina's actions was mind-boggling. She had stopped pretending that her secret indulgences were harmless or private. She openly declared herself divorced and remarried, stripping Claudius of his power in the eyes of the public. She had effectively launched a personal rebellion against the empire's stability. Messalina began referring to Silius as the emperor and herself as his empress, fully believing that she could replace Claudius and take control of the empire by force of will and by manipulating her vast network of blackmail victims. She issued orders in Silius's name, even planning a formal coronation ceremony that would legitimize their rule. However, Silius, initially flattered by the attention, soon found himself trapped in Messalina's dangerous web. He was now the centerpiece of her ultimate fantasy, not just sexual domination, but complete political transformation of Rome according to her vision. Historical accounts suggest that Silius began planning to escape, realizing too late that he had become a pawn in Messalina's deadly game of ambition and manipulation. Meanwhile, Claudius remained blissfully unaware of his wife's actions until loyal freedmen risked their lives to inform him of the growing crisis. At first, the emperor could hardly believe what he was hearing. Even for Messalina, the idea of bigamy, marrying another man while still being legally married to the emperor, seemed unimaginable. But as more evidence came to light, including testimonies and official documents, it became undeniable. Claudius realized that not only had his wife betrayed him, but she had also staged a rebellion against his reign and threatened the stability of the empire itself. The confrontation that followed was swift and brutal. Claudius returned to Rome with loyal soldiers, determined to put an end to Messalina's dangerous game. When he confronted her in the gardens where she was celebrating her new marriage with Silius, the scene was one of chaos. Messalina, in her defiance, seemed to realize the extent of her betrayal, but it was too late. Her empire of manipulation and blackmail had crumbled under the weight of imperial power. Claudius ordered Messalina's execution, and her downfall was quick and final. The emperor also ordered that her name be erased from all public monuments, her images destroyed, and her memory condemned through de media memoria, a complete and utter erasure from history. Messalina, who had once used her sexuality to control the most powerful men in Rome, was herself subjected to the full force of state power. Her death marked the end of an era where sexual scandals and personal manipulation had nearly overtaken political competence in governing the Roman Empire. Messalina's swift execution was not just a personal tragedy, it was a moment of reckoning for the empire itself. Her ability to manipulate the highest echelons of Roman society had been terrifying, and her death symbolized the collapse of an entire system of corruption, sexual exploitation, and political subversion. Yet even in death, she left behind a legacy that would haunt Rome for generations to come. The empire had been on the verge of disintegration, not because of military defeat or economic collapse, but because of the unchecked power wielded by one woman who had used her sexuality to manipulate and control her peers. Claudius, though devastated by the betrayal, was forced to move quickly to stabilize his reign. The political damage had already been done, as Messalina's network of blackmail victims had been carefully placed throughout the empire. Many of the senators, military commanders, and wealthy merchants who had been compromised by her sexual manipulation remained in power, silent and afraid, even after her death. It took years for Claudius to purge these individuals from the imperial system, and even then, the scars of Messalina's reign remained. Her story became a cautionary tale for the future emperors of Rome. The emperor's court, which had once been a place of reverence and ceremony, was now viewed with suspicion and fear, particularly by the Roman elite. Messalina's rise and fall served as a grim reminder of how power could be subverted from within, not through war or conquest, but through the exploitation of the most basic human desires. For the people of Rome, however, Messalina's reign was a blur of rumors, scandal, and dark fascination. Her name became synonymous with decadence and depravity, and her actions were used as a tool for political enemies to tarnish the reputation of her successors. Her name was erased from monuments, but her legacy of manipulation, sexual power, and political chaos remained etched in the minds of the Roman populace. Despite her fall from grace, Messalina's story revealed a chilling truth about the corruptibility of absolute power. She was just an empress lost to decadence. She was a symbol of the dangers of unchecked authority, of how even the most powerful individuals can be consumed by their desires and ambitions. Her obsession with control and humiliation had twisted her into something far more dangerous, and a mere empress she had become a threat to the very foundation of the empire. The story of Messalina, though obscured and distorted by time, remains one of the most disturbing chapters in Roman history. It is a story of ambition and manipulation, of a woman who used the power, sex, and humiliation to control an empire. Her ultimate downfall, though tragic, was perhaps the only possible end for someone who had waged such a relentless campaign against both the moral fabric of Rome and the imperial order. As we reflect on Messalina's life, her actions leave us with a chilling lesson about the fragility of power and the dangers that lie in the pursuit of absolute control. While her aim may have been erased from history, her legacy still lingers as a dark reminder of how deeply personal desires can threaten the very structures that hold empires together.